years after January 6th, there is going to be a ton of redefining of that day, what it meant, and the lasting importance. And most of it is going to be incorrect. So I want to set the record straight about a bunch of things today so we can properly understand January 6th in the full context, not as the events of an isolated day. First, though, let's talk about that isolated day. We had a rigged election in 2020. Never before in this country's history have we had the election system completely turned upside down, with ballots mailed across the country, collected at all hours with no rules to govern it. No one will ever be able to tell you what the final tallies of that election were. People were furious. They deserved to be furious over that, and still furious today. They had every right to protest that election. In fact, that is the long American tradition of how we test elections for their validity and to build public confidence. We question the system. It is a tradition as old as time. It has happened since the dawn of the Republic from both the left and the right. Well, that was ripped away from Americans as a matter of right in 2020. And of course, people were upset about it. They had every right to exercise their constitutional rights and show up at the Capitol to voice their concerns about a stolen election. Second, we need to understand the fuller context. January 6th is just a day on the calendar. The fight to extinguish the realignment in American politics has been going on for much longer, arguably back to President Trump announcing his candidacy for the presidency in 2015 when he came down the golden escalator. Since that day, there have been plots of various types, magnitude, and from different parties meant to ensure that a class of patriotic Americans could never organize and express political support behind a new movement. Not a movement controlled by internationalist Republican corporatist interests on the right, so-called, or on the left, the demagogues and anti-American interests seeking to undermine this country to this day. The special interest and donor class could never have that. They still don't want it. It's still happening today. That's why you'll see failed politicians like former Vice President Mike Pence, who President Trump picked up out of the garbage pile of the political dustbin, trying to redefine January 6th in a way that tries to undo what can be undone, the realignment of American politics. That is a strand that runs through every hoax concocted against President Trump, the Russiagate scandal, Arctic frost, you name it. And not only President Trump, but his very supporters. And January 6th presented a final opportunity for those who hate this political realignment to use the tools that were asymmetrically in their power to extinguish it once and for all. It is the fulcrum event in the weaponization of government. January 6th gave the cover, both rhetorically, politically, and legally, to justify in their minds the complete and total abuse of our legal systems, of our institutions like media, of our law firm culture, the job culture. Everything you could use to put the screws on somebody was used, justified based upon what was advertised to have happened on January 6th. That is the first chapter of the wide-scale weaponization of government. Everything that happens after January 6th is explained away by being justified because January 6th in their mind was just so bad. Now, the reason why the efforts were so successful in causing so much harm, destroying so many lives, was that because they picked on a fundamental series of asymmetries, of power imbalances within the United States of America. The most obvious one is the force of law. The FBI, the intelligence agencies, these institutions after 9/11, we as a people made the major trade-off of civil liberties and protections for total power of the states to invest in their surveillance authorities under the guise that they would be deployed against enemies overseas. Those powers were turned inwards and for political purposes over the scapegoats on January 6th. Now, they're also able to get away with this and cause so much damage because the right was willing to let it happen. And many aspects of it are still willing to let it happen today. Many who didn't support the political realignment and, a patriotic class of Americans expressing a pretty concrete and simple set of political ideas wanted the January 6th events to be used to set the clock back to the era of Bush politics. This was the thinking amongst all of the political elites, nearly. President Trump was left for dead. Nobody wanted to stand by him. He was denounced by people today that say they're his best friend. You go back to January 7th and 8th and 9th, you could see them one by one finally taking the shot where they thought they had the cover to say what they truly felt. Well, they're back on script now, and that's almost more dangerous than where we were before. Let's look at Capitol Hill.
Some of the congressmen that we hold up to be our toughest attack dogs and watchdogs, where were they post-January 6th? Nowhere to be found. In fact, many of them ran away from it. Let's focus on one for a second. Chairman Jim Jordan, a fan favorite of yesteryear of Republican politicians, who chaired, the Judiciary Committee, which then established the so-called Committee on the Weaponization of Government. This was supposed to be our answer to the January 6th committee. It had available to it over $20 million in budget, the same amount of money that the January 6th committee had available to it and caused a ton of fraudulent damage. Instead of using the powers to actually, have an equal and opposite effect of that congressional committee, they spent none of the money. They had a weaponization committee, but they did no weaponization work. They subpoenaed no one meaningfully. They called no one in. They found nothing new. And they basically used it as a cover to pretend that they were actually indeed doing something about it. Out of that $20 million, they spent probably no more than $4 million. And most of that went to their own internal staff raises and business as usual. They didn't talk about January 6th at all. Now, most politicians, now that the tides have changed and President Trump's back in office, will run back and try to embrace him and pretend that none of that history ever happened. I haven't forgotten that these people did not lift a finger, and you shouldn't either. Because let's be honest, we only have a few years left with President Trump in the White House, and where people are ultimately afraid of their shadows when around him. As soon as he leaves, this whole thing could go back to where we started. And our people will be as prone as they were on January 6th and moving forward. And not only those most closely connected to President Trump, but the other victims of ideological weaponization we see in every other fact pattern you can imagine. Enemies of the state. Another class that we're going to get into today is the complete and utter failure of what is pompously called the conservative legal movement. There is no such thing as the conservative legal movement. Nothing that gets anywhere close to the equivalent of the left, which is combined with the power of the total state. Instead, we have a bunch of self-congratulatory beard strokers that want to sit back and write white papers and condemn those that they are embarrassed of. The victims of weaponization, those who can never show up to the country club parties or donate their way into the right dinner, or pretend to laugh and smile at that paper on the table about some constitutional issue that nobody's going to read, that'll exist only in an ever-long paragraph of footnotes about a biography that had no impact on the trajectory of the country. That is what is self-congratulatory called the conservative legal movement. None of these so-called, leaders of that stepped up or lifted a meaningful finger after January 6th, or even for President Trump's own legal defenses. Instead, people were left to empty their bank accounts, mortgage their house over and over again, and suffer immense financial consequences just to find any lawyer that was willing to take that case. Today, we're going to talk about that with some lawyers who did step up. This is, to the extent we can call it, the emergence of a new conservative legal movement. The people who actually believe in what they're doing. Instead of wanting to tend to their own resumes and sinecures, the people who are actually fighting the fight that needs to be fought. That is the weaponization of government and that fundamental asymmetry where you can be crushed if you do not believe in the total state.